My name is Corinne, and I'm 59 years old, but the day my son-in-law called me too weak, I felt about 100. Those words weren't just an insult, they were a mirror I didn't want to look into. It was a Saturday evening, one of those rare family dinners I used to look forward to. I had roasted chicken in the oven, my daughter Maggie was helping set the table, and Brad, her husband, was on the couch, glued to his phone, as always. When Maggie called him to eat, he sighed, stood up and muttered, "Guess I'll help the elderly tonight." He said it with that half-smile of his, the kind people wear when they think they're funny but really just mean. I brushed it off, like I always did. I had learned long ago that responding to Brad only made things worse. We sat down to dinner, and for a few brief moments, it felt almost normal. I asked about their jobs, their plans, how Maggie's new project at the firm was going. She started talking enthusiastically about a promotion she was up for, until Brad interrupted her to correct every small detail. He couldn't let her shine, not even for a second. Then he turned his attention to me. "So, Corinne," he said between bites, "how's the health? Still struggling with those dizzy spells?" His tone was patronizing, and I could feel Maggie's discomfort across the table. I gave a small nod and said, "Some days are harder than others, but I manage." He smirked, shaking his head. "You really should think about letting someone else handle your finances. I mean, with your health and all, it's a lot to keep up with. Don't you think you're a little too weak for all that?" That word, weak, hung in the air like smoke. Maggie let out an awkward laugh, the kind that tries to smooth things over, but I could tell even she felt uneasy. I stared down at my plate, gripping my fork tighter than I meant to. My chest burned, not from anger at first, but from humiliation. I've been through childbirth, cancer scares, the death of my husband, and the loneliness of an empty home, and somehow, this smug, self-assured man thought he had the right to call me weak. I forced a smile and said quietly, "I've managed fine all these years, Brad. But thank you for your concern." He shrugged, as if brushing away my words. "I just worry, that's all. Maggie and I want to make sure things are taken care of. Before, something happens." He said it so casually, I almost didn't register the implication. Before something happens. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, Brad's words replaying in my mind like a cruel echo. Too weak. Maybe to him, I was a frail woman nearing 60, her husband gone, her hands trembling when she poured her morning tea. But what he didn't know was that those hands once built an entire business beside my husband. That they'd balanced books, signed contracts, and kept our family afloat through storms Brad couldn't begin to imagine. As the clock ticked past midnight, I thought about the past few months, how Brad had been offering to help with my finances ever since my husband's passing. He'd offered to organize my paperwork, check the mail, and update my insurance information. I'd been grateful at first, believing he genuinely wanted to help. But now, those gestures looked different under the harsh light of his words. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside me, and went through my recent bank statements. Something didn't feel right. A few small withdrawals I couldn't remember making, checks with signatures that looked almost like mine but not quite. I tried to tell myself it was my own forgetfulness, but my gut knew better. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maggie had always adored Brad. She saw him as charming, responsible, the kind of man who took care of things. I didn't want to plant seeds of doubt in her mind unless I was sure. But I couldn't ignore what I was starting to see, the way he'd look at me when I spoke, as if waiting for me to stumble. The way he'd talk about my house as if it were already his. That evening, I went to my bedroom and took out the small wooden box my husband had left me, the one that held our legal documents, including our will. I hadn't looked at it since his passing. As I held the papers, I realized that everything we had built together, every dollar, every asset, was now in my name. It was mine to protect. And suddenly, I knew what I had to do. I might have been tired, slower than before, and yes, even a little fragile, but I was not weak. Weakness was letting people like Brad take what didn't belong to them. Weakness was silence. I sat there for hours, making a mental list of everything I needed to check: our lawyer, my accounts, every document with my signature. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that Brad's interest in my well-being wasn't about care. It was about control. I went to bed as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight cutting through my curtains. I felt something stirring inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger anymore. It was determination. But I had no idea that one insult would set off a chain of betrayals I could never forget. The next morning, I started digging through my financial records with shaking hands. The sunlight was pouring through the kitchen window, but it felt cold against my skin. My coffee sat untouched, the steam curling into the air as I flipped through a stack of papers I hadn't looked at in months. There was a time when I trusted Maggie and Brad completely, when I believed that family meant safety. But after that dinner, something inside me had changed. I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Brad's interest in my affairs wasn't just meddling, it was calculated. I went through my recent bank statements again, this time with a sharper eye. Line by line, I compared transactions, dates, and signatures. That's when I found it a $3,000 withdrawal I couldn't recall making. The check number matched one that had been in my checkbook. But when I pulled the stub out from my drawer, it was missing. The realization made my stomach twist. I checked another statement, another missing check, another withdrawal. I picked up the phone and called Maggie. I tried to keep my voice steady, but she immediately heard the tension. "Mom, what's wrong?" she asked. "Have you or Brad been by the house recently?" "I'm missing some checks," I said carefully. She sighed, sounding irritated. "Mom, you probably misplaced them again. You've been forgetting things lately, remember?" That stung. Forgetfulness? I knew what she was implying and where she'd learned it. Brad had been planting that seed for months, casually mentioning my senior moments in front of her. I bit my tongue and forced a small laugh. "Maybe you're right," I said. But the doubt was already there, like a splinter under the skin. When we hung up, I sat there in silence, the house feeling suddenly too big, too quiet. My husband's old photograph sat on the mantel. I stared at it, whispering, "You'd know what to do." He always did. He'd been meticulous about our finances, and I'd tried my best to keep up since his death. But this was beyond me. I needed help, the right kind of help. That afternoon, I called Mr. Fuller, our family lawyer and my late husband's trusted confidant. His voice, calm and familiar, eased my nerves. When I told him about my suspicions, there was a long pause. "Corinne," he said slowly, "when was the last time you reviewed your will?" "It's been a few years." "Why?" "Because I got a notice last month that some changes had been made." My heart skipped. "Changes? What kind of changes?" "I was told you wanted to update the beneficiaries. I received instructions from Brad and Maggie with your supposed authorization." For a moment, the world tilted. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I never told them to do that," I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. "I thought it was strange," Mr. Fuller continued gently. "That's why I held off on finalizing anything. But they brought documents signed in your name." I closed my eyes, fighting the nausea rising in my throat. My own son-in-law had forged my signature. Maggie must have believed him, or maybe she hadn't asked any questions at all. I didn't know which hurt more, the betrayal or the blindness. I met with Mr. Fuller the next morning. He laid the paperwork in front of me, and there it was, my name, perfectly written, but not mine. I could tell. My husband used to say my R's had a small loop that no one else could replicate, and this version didn't have it. Mr. Fuller looked at me across the desk. "Do you want to press charges?" he asked softly. I hesitated. "Not yet," I whispered. "I want to see how far he'll go." He nodded, understanding immediately. We agreed to keep the matter confidential. Fuller promised to safeguard the existing will and ensure no one had access to any documents without my consent. As I left his office, the crisp morning air hit me like a wake-up call. Brad thought I was weak, that I'd crumble quietly under his manipulation, but he was wrong. I had spent my whole life surviving things much worse than arrogance. I began documenting everything: the missing checks, the strange bank activity, every conversation with Brad and Maggie. I even kept a small notebook hidden inside my kitchen drawer. Each page felt like armor, proof that I wasn't losing my mind. A few days later, Brad dropped by unannounced. He had that fake smile plastered on his face, the one that made my skin crawl. "Hey Mom," he said casually. "Just thought I'd stop in to see how you're holding up." I offered him tea, pretending not to notice how his eyes darted to the mail pile on the counter. "You really shouldn't worry about all these bills," he said, picking one up. "I can take care of them for you. Maggie and I want to make things easier." I smiled politely. "That's very kind, Brad. But I think I'll manage." He chuckled. "Suit yourself." The moment he left, I locked the door behind him and hid the mail in a drawer. My hands trembled, but my resolve had never been clearer. He thought he could outsmart me, that I'd sit quietly while he drained the life out of everything my husband and I built. He had no idea that I'd already started setting a trap. That night, I called Mr. Fuller again. "I want to make some changes," I told him. "But this time, we'll do it quietly." He didn't ask for details, he just said, "I'll have everything ready." As I hung up the phone, I looked out the window at the darkened street. My reflection in the glass looked older, harder, but stronger too. I wasn't the fragile woman Brad thought I was. Brad thought I was too weak to fight back, but weakness can be the perfect disguise. I decided to let Brad believe I was the same frail woman he mocked. If that's what he wanted to see, then that's what I'd show him. People like Brad thrive on control. They feed on the illusion that everyone else is smaller than them. I realized the only way to outsmart him wasn't by confrontation, but by quiet calculation. So I began playing the part. I pretended to forget things. I lost my glasses more often. I acted uncertain when signing small documents or writing checks. When Brad came over, I'd fumble with my pen or hesitate before answering a question, just to see the flicker of smugness spread across his face. And it worked. Every time he called me forgetful, I'd nod and smile like it didn't hurt. But behind that smile, I was watching, recording every little clue, every mistake he made while thinking I wasn't paying attention. Maggie noticed the act too, though she didn't realize it was an act. She grew more distant, as if she'd already accepted Brad's version of me, the fragile widow who couldn't handle her own affairs. She'd say things like, "Mom, maybe Brad's right. Maybe you should let him manage things for a while." It broke my heart, but I'd just smile softly and say, "Maybe, sweetheart. I'll think about it." Meanwhile, I set things in motion quietly. I had a security system installed, but told them to keep the cameras discreet, hidden inside picture frames and decorative lights. I redirected important mail to a private P.O. box. I bought a small fireproof safe and hid it in the laundry room, behind the cleaning supplies where Brad would never look. Inside, I kept my new legal papers, my updated will, and copies of every suspicious transaction I'd uncovered. Brad started dropping by more often, always under the guise of checking in. He'd sit in the kitchen pretending to chat, but his eyes would wander toward my drawers, my papers, even the laptop I used for online banking. Once, I caught him glancing at a piece of mail addressed to me from the insurance company. He didn't notice that I saw. One afternoon, he offered to help pay a few bills online for me. I handed him an old notebook and told him I couldn't remember my login password. He grinned, saying, "That's all right, Mom, I'll figure it out." I just smiled back, pretending gratitude, while I recorded the entire interaction on my phone under the table. That night, I called Mr. Fuller again. "I want to move everything to a different account," I told him. "One Brad doesn't know about." He agreed and arranged it immediately. We opened a new savings account and transferred most of my funds discreetly. My old accounts were left with just enough to look ordinary. Over the next few weeks, I perfected the act. Every time Brad came over, I made sure he saw exactly what he wanted, a helpless woman grateful for his guidance. If I dropped a spoon, I'd mutter, "Clumsy me." If I forgot what day it was, I'd laugh it off. It wasn't easy. I had spent my entire life being independent, raising Maggie while supporting my husband through long nights of running our small business. Acting weak went against every fiber of who I was. But the look on Brad's face whenever he underestimated me gave me strength. Maggie, sweet as she was, seemed torn between love and denial. I could see how much she wanted to believe her husband was a good man. Whenever I hinted at concern, she'd say, "Mom, he's just trying to help. He loves us both." I wanted to shake her, to tell her that real love doesn't come with control. But I bit my tongue. I needed her to see it herself because when she did, it would change everything. A week later, I met Mr. Fuller again, and this time, we took the final step. We drafted a new will. Brad's name was removed completely, erased as though he'd never existed in my estate. Maggie remained my primary beneficiary, but with a condition she could only inherit if she wasn't married to Brad or if he predeceased her. It was harsh but necessary. Mr. Fuller understood, sealing the documents with his usual precision. I left his office that day with a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in years. When I got home, Brad was waiting in the driveway. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Where were you, Mom?" he asked. His tone carried that false sweetness I'd come to despise. "Just errands," I said. "Groceries and such." He glanced at my empty hands. "Without bags?" "I had them delivered," I replied easily. He stared for a second longer before forcing a smile. That night, I sat in my armchair by the window, watching the streetlights flicker. The neighborhood was quiet, but my thoughts weren't. I knew Brad was starting to get suspicious. He wasn't a patient man, and when people like him feel control slipping away, they get reckless. I was counting on that. As I turned off the light, I thought about all the years I'd tried to keep peace, to make holidays pleasant, to pretend everything was fine for Maggie's sake. Not anymore. Brad had taken my kindness for weakness, and now he was about to learn just how dangerous that mistake could be. Soon I would give Brad exactly what he thought he wanted, just not in the way he expected. A month later, I invited them over for dinner under the guise of reconciliation. I made it sound casual, like a peace offering after all the subtle tension between us. "You two should come by on Sunday," I told Maggie over the phone. "It's been too long since we had a proper family dinner." She sounded genuinely happy, which gave me comfort. Brad, on the other hand, hesitated before agreeing. "Sure thing, Mom," he finally said. "We'll bring the wine." His tone was smooth, but I could sense his guard lowering. That entire weekend, I planned every detail of that dinner like a general preparing for battle. I set the table with the best china, the same set my husband and I had used for our 30th anniversary. I roasted lamb with rosemary, baked bread from scratch, and even made Brad's favorite chocolate soufflé. I wanted everything perfect, comforting, and familiar. The goal was simple: make him feel safe, confident, in control. When they arrived, Maggie was glowing, dressed in soft blue. Brad wore his usual smugness like a second skin. He walked in and immediately scanned the room, as if assessing his kingdom. "Smells great in here," he said, flashing that rehearsed grin. "Did you make all this yourself?" "Yes," I said, smiling. "I may be old, but I'm not too weak for a little cooking." He laughed, missing the barb completely. Maggie busied herself helping me with the dishes while Brad poured wine, making casual conversation that barely disguised his arrogance. I could tell he believed my performance, that I'd accepted his helpful dominance. He'd taken the bait beautifully. We sat down to eat, the three of us passing dishes around, making polite small talk. I told them I'd been thinking about simplifying things, selling a few old assets, updating documents, and maybe even revising my will. The reaction was immediate. Brad perked up like a predator scenting blood. "That's a smart idea, Mom," he said quickly. "I've actually been meaning to talk to you about that. It'd be easier for everyone if we got everything streamlined." "Streamlined?" I repeated, feigning confusion. "Yeah," he said, cutting into his lamb. "You know, make sure everything's in order, transfer accounts, consolidate paperwork. I could handle most of it for you, free of charge." Maggie smiled weakly, clearly uncomfortable, but she didn't object. She probably thought he was being helpful. My heart ached for her. I wanted to scream, "Can't you see what he's doing?" But I swallowed the words. The time wasn't right. Instead, I smiled and said, "That's kind of you, Brad. Maybe you can come by next week and help me with the paperwork." His eyes sparkled with greed and self-satisfaction. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I'll make sure everything's in the right place." We continued eating. I kept the conversation light, stories from Maggie's childhood, my husband's old jokes, memories that filled the house with warmth. But beneath that warmth was something else, a tension I could almost taste. After dessert, I excused myself, saying I'd forgotten to bring out the coffee. I slipped into the hallway, where I could see the reflection of the dining room in a framed mirror. Brad leaned toward Maggie, his voice low but sharp. "She's finally coming around," he said. "We'll have everything sorted soon." Maggie sighed. "Brad, please don't talk like that." "I'm serious," he muttered. "It's time things were under proper management. She can't handle this stuff anymore." My chest tightened. Hearing him speak about me like I was some burden, some obstacle, it hurt more than I expected. But it also solidified my resolve. I took a deep breath, composed myself, and walked back in with the coffee pot, smiling as if I'd heard nothing. When I placed his cup in front of him, he looked up and said, "You're awfully quiet tonight, Mom. Something on your mind?" I met his eyes and smiled sweetly. "Just thinking how lucky I am to have such a thoughtful son-in-law." He chuckled, oblivious. "Well, I do my best." We lingered over coffee, and I made sure the atmosphere stayed comfortable. The goal was to keep him relaxed, unaware that I had already set everything in motion. My new will was signed, sealed, and stored safely away. Brad was already erased from it, and I'd taken every precaution to ensure he'd never find out, at least not until I wanted him to. When they finally stood to leave, Brad hugged me stiffly, that false politeness never wavering. "We'll get started next week," he said confidently. "Perfect," I replied with a soft smile. "I'll be ready." After they left, I locked the door and leaned against it, letting out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The house was quiet again, but not the kind of quiet that felt lonely. This quiet felt like focus, like the calm before a storm. I walked to the mirror in the hallway and looked at my reflection. For the first time in a long while, I saw something sharp in my own eyes. Determination. My husband used to call it my steel look. It was back. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my armchair by the window, the street outside bathed in silver moonlight. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard, the arrogance in Brad's voice, the resignation in Maggie's. My daughter was trapped in a web spun by a man who thought kindness was weakness and manipulation was intelligence. But I wasn't going to pull Maggie out of that web by force. I would make Brad undo himself. I would let his own greed expose him, one thread at a time. He had underestimated me, and soon he would learn that the woman he mocked for being too weak had been quietly preparing his downfall. That was the night I decided Brad would never see a cent of my money again. The following week, I met with Mr. Fuller behind closed doors. The air in his office was cool and still, carrying the faint smell of leather and old paper. It reminded me of my husband, the same quiet strength, the same order in chaos. I sat down across from Mr. Fuller, clutching my handbag like it contained the last pieces of my dignity. I didn't need to explain much. He already understood why I was there. "I've made my decision," I said firmly. "Brad is not to receive anything. Not a dollar. Not a memory. Not a trace." "Mr. Fuller nodded slowly, his expression calm but approving. "I thought you might say that," he said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were drafts of the new will. "We'll keep your daughter, of course?" "Yes," I said softly, "but with a condition." He raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Maggie will inherit only if she is no longer married to Brad, or if he passes before I do." He didn't flinch at the coldness of it. "That's a strong clause." "It's a necessary one," I replied. "She's blinded right now, but she's a good woman. When she finally sees him for who he is, I want her to have a chance at freedom without losing everything." Mr. Fuller leaned back, his fingers steepled. You remind me of your husband in moments like this. He always said you had the heart of a lioness. I smiled faintly. He was always better with words than I am. For the next hour, we went through every detail: my home, my savings, the business assets, even the small jewelry pieces that carried sentimental value. Everything was catalogued, sealed with precision. I decided to dedicate a portion of my estate to the children's hospital my husband had once supported. It felt right. He believed in building legacies that gave back. When the new will was finally printed, I felt something loosen inside me. It was as if years of fear and frustration had been pulled from my chest. I signed the documents with steady hands, each stroke of the pen a quiet declaration of power. Mr. Fuller notarized every page, then looked up at me with that faint, fatherly smile he always had. "Corinne," he said softly, "you're stronger than they think." I swallowed hard. "I know," I said. "But I need to make sure he never finds out about this, not until the time is right." He assured me the documents would be secured in his private vault, with duplicates stored in a separate location. "You can rest easy," he said. "Your wishes are protected." I left his office feeling like a different woman. The afternoon sun was blindingly bright. And for the first time in months, I didn't flinch from it. I walked slowly down the block, every step echoing with quiet confidence. The people passing by didn't know it. But I had just rewritten my future and Brad's. When I arrived home, the house felt lighter, as if it, too, sensed the shift in the air. I brewed myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from the cup. My hands were steady now. The tremor that had once betrayed me was gone. I thought about my husband again, how proud he would have been of me for standing my ground. Later that evening, Maggie called. "Mom," she said cheerfully, "Brad's excited to come by tomorrow to help with your paperwork. Do you want me to bring anything?" For a moment, I wanted to tell her everything, to warn her about the trap she was living in, to show her the evidence I'd gathered. But then I remembered how defensive she'd been before. She wasn't ready to see it yet, and I couldn't risk Brad catching on. So, I smiled through the phone and said, "That would be lovely, dear. Just bring yourselves." When I hung up, the quiet of the house returned. I walked into my husband's old study, where the faint scent of his cologne still lingered on the books. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk and found the photograph I'd been avoiding for months, the one of the three of us on Maggie's wedding day. I ran my fingers over it, tracing the happiness that used to live in our faces. How quickly love can turn into control when it falls into the wrong hands. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I packed away the old will and all the outdated papers, labeling them harmlessly as personal keepsakes. I hid the new documents behind the false wall panel in the laundry room safe. No one would think to look there, especially not Brad. When he and Maggie arrived later that day, I met them at the door with the same warm smile I'd worn at dinner. Brad had a stack of folders tucked under his arm and that same confident glint in his eyes. "Ready to get organized, Mom?" he said. "Of course," I replied sweetly, stepping aside to let them in. I offered him tea and watched as he took his usual seat at the dining table, spreading his papers out like a conqueror laying out his maps. He talked endlessly about simplifying and consolidating, throwing around business jargon he didn't understand. I nodded, feigned confusion at the right times, and let him believe he was winning. By the time they left, I had signed nothing, committed to nothing, and promised everything. Brad looked pleased. He thought he'd charmed me again. But I knew better. My assets were protected, my will rewritten, and my intentions sealed tight. As their car disappeared down the street, I stood, and by the window, arms crossed. The night air was cool, and for the first time in years, I felt truly calm. Brad thought he had me right where he wanted me, but he didn't realize the ground beneath his feet had already shifted. But even with my plan in place, I had no idea Brad was about to make his boldest move yet. 3 weeks later, I received a call from the bank about a large transfer request. It was early morning, and I was in the garden watering my roses when the phone rang. The woman on the other end spoke politely but cautiously, asking to confirm whether I'd authorized a $25,000 transfer to a private account I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped. My voice came out quiet, almost too calm. "No," I said. "I didn't authorize anything." She hesitated. "Mrs. Walker, the request came through with a signed authorization form. Your signature is on it." I asked her to email me a copy immediately. When I opened the attachment a few minutes later, my hands went cold. There it was, my name, written in my handwriting, but not mine. Whoever had done it had studied me carefully. The loops were right, the slant nearly perfect. But the signature lacked the small pressure curve I always left at the end of my E. My husband used to call it my signature smile. I didn't need proof beyond that. It was Brad. I thanked the bank manager and told her I'd come by to straighten it out. My heart was pounding as I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the document on my screen, feeling both rage and disbelief twist inside me. The man had actually forged my name. After everything, after all his subtle games, his manipulations, he'd crossed the line from deceit into crime. By the time I reached the bank, I had regained my composure. I met with the branch manager, showed my identification, and froze the account immediately. "We'll initiate an internal investigation," she assured me. "You should also file a report with authorities." And I did. That afternoon, I called the detective Mr. Fuller had once recommended, a quiet man named Detective Hawthorne, who specialized in financial elder abuse. I explained everything, from the missing checks to the forged documents. His tone was serious but steady. "You did the right thing contacting us," he said. "We'll start gathering evidence immediately. But you'll need to be careful, don't alert him yet." I promised I wouldn't. When Maggie stopped by that evening, I decided to test the waters. "Maggie," I began softly, "did Brad mention anything about money lately?" She frowned, confused. "Money? No, why?" I hesitated, trying to sound casual. "Just wondering. I got a strange call from the bank today." Her eyes widened slightly. "What kind of call?" "Oh, just a mix-up. A transfer I didn't authorize. I sorted it out." I smiled, pretending it was nothing. She looked uneasy, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Mom, I'm sure it's just a banking error. Brad said he's been helping you pay bills. Maybe it's something he set up by accident." There it was. The perfect cover story fed to her by the man himself. I nodded slowly. "Maybe," I said. "He's always so helpful." That night, after Maggie left, I opened the safe and began gathering everything: statements, old checks, and the printed forgery. I slipped them into a folder labeled insurance in case Brad ever came snooping. Then I sat down at my desk and wrote in my notebook, my hand trembling slightly from anger. "He crossed the line today. The mask is slipping." Over the next week, Detective Hawthorne called a few times for updates. He said the forged document matched the same writing style used on one of the altered checks I'd reported earlier. He was building a case quietly, and I was instructed to act normal to let Brad believe I hadn't noticed anything. It was one of the hardest performances of my life. When Brad and Maggie came over that weekend, I forced a smile and made them tea. Brad was in his usual good mood, bragging about a business opportunity he was investing in. I noticed how his hands fidgeted, how he avoided eye contact. Guilt leaves a scent, even when wrapped in confidence. He tried once again to bring up my finances. "Mom," he said, feigning concern. "You've got a lot of accounts open. It might be better if I consolidate them into one less to keep track of." I tilted my head. "That's a great idea, Brad. Maybe we can talk about it next week." He smiled, satisfied, having no idea that the police were already watching him. After they left, I called Detective Hawthorne and told him everything that had happened. He advised patience. "Men like him," he said, "get sloppy when they think they've won." For the first time, I felt the stirrings of something I hadn't in a long time control. I was no longer a pawn in his little game. I was the one moving pieces now. Still, there was Maggie. My sweet, trusting Maggie. I knew she was caught between love and denial, still unable to accept who her husband really was. And part of me hated myself for what was coming, for the heartbreak she would face when the truth came out. But I couldn't protect her by keeping quiet anymore. That night, as I closed my notebook and set it back in the drawer, I whispered to my husband's photograph on the mantel. "He called me weak," I said softly. "Let's see how strong he feels when the floor crumbles beneath him." I was done being quiet, and Brad had no idea his every move was now being watched. I started visiting them more often, pretending to seek Brad's help with trivial things. To Maggie, it probably looked like I was finally softening, like I was learning to depend on them more. But every time I stepped into their house, it was with one purpose: to watch him, to study him, and to gather evidence without raising suspicion. Brad thrived on feeling needed. When I asked him to fix a computer issue or explain a letter from my insurance company, his chest would puff up with importance. He'd say things like, "Don't worry, Mom, I've got this handled," in that tone that always made me feel like I was being dismissed, not helped. It was insulting, but I smiled through it. Let him think I was slow. Let him believe his little act of superiority was working. One afternoon, I brought over a stack of bills and asked him to help me sort them. I sat beside him as he flipped through the envelopes, his eyes scanning faster than they should. He wasn't looking at due dates, he was searching for something else. I noticed how his gaze lingered on the bank statements and the insurance correspondence. His fingers twitched slightly every time he saw my account numbers. That was when I started recording. A small audio recorder, no bigger than a lipstick tube, hidden inside my purse. It caught everything: his patronizing tone, his subtle jabs, and most importantly, his arrogance. He'd grown so confident, so sure of his control, that he stopped being careful with his words. "Honestly," he told Maggie one afternoon while I sat dozing on the couch, "I don't know how your mom managed before me. She's all over the place." Maggie chuckled softly, though her voice carried a trace of guilt. "She's just getting older, Brad," he smirked. "Yeah, well, she's lucky she's got me to take over when the time comes." The words made my skin crawl. But I stayed perfectly still, my hand gripping the armrest to keep myself from reacting. The recorder caught every syllable. Over the next few weeks, I built a collection: hours of audio clips, copies of emails, photos of documents he handled. Detective Hawthorne told me the evidence was growing strong enough for charges, but we needed one more solid piece: proof that Brad was still actively trying to access or manipulate my finances. So, I kept playing the fool. I'd visit with baked goods, laugh too loudly at his dull jokes, and accidentally leave mail on the counter to see what he'd do. Every time, he took the bait. He'd peek when he thought I wasn't looking, slide envelopes slightly closer to himself, or make notes on his phone. But he was starting to get careless. He'd stopped hiding his irritation when I didn't move as fast as he wanted. Once, when I told him I wanted to think before signing a form, he muttered under his breath, "You don't have much time to think, old woman." It was so soft that Maggie didn't catch it, but I did. I stared at him for a second, long enough for him to notice. Then I smiled, pretending I hadn't heard. The mask of frailty was working better than I could have imagined. Maggie, meanwhile, was showing signs of strain. Her smiles were thinner, her patience shorter. Sometimes, she'd call me late at night, sounding exhausted. "Brad's been stressed lately," she'd say. "He's under pressure at work." I always listened quietly, never criticizing him. I knew if I pushed too hard, she'd defend him out of habit. I needed her to come to her own realization, not feel cornered. Then, one evening, Brad came to my house alone. He said Maggie was at a work event. "I thought I'd check on you," he said with false cheer. He looked around the living room as he spoke, his eyes darting toward my desk where I usually kept my files. "You really should let me handle this financial stuff," he pressed. "It's a lot for you to keep track of." "I'm fine, Brad," I said evenly. He sighed dramatically, rubbing his temples. "Corinne, I'm trying to help. You don't want to make mistakes with your money, do you?" That word mistakes dripped with condescension. I gave a little laugh. "You're right, dear. I do make mistakes. That's why I'm careful who I trust." For a brief second, his jaw tightened, his charm flickering away like a blown-out candle. Then he forced a grin. "Of course. Just looking out for you." That's all. After he left, I sat in silence. The walls of my house feeling closer than ever. The fear I once had was gone. In its place was a quiet, calculated rage. He thought he was the spider, but he'd been walking straight into my web the entire time. I sent the latest audio recordings to Detective Hawthorne the next morning. He called back not long after, his tone sharper now. Mrs. Walker, this is enough to move forward. But if you're willing, we can wait just a little longer, see if he tries to take direct action again. The more evidence we have, the harder it will be for him to wriggle out of it. I agreed. Patience had become my greatest weapon. Days passed. Brad kept acting the same, smug, confident, oblivious. Maggie seemed caught in a fog, sensing something was wrong but not ready to face it. I spent my evenings writing notes, documenting each visit, each interaction, each word that revealed his growing carelessness. By then, even I could sense it. Brad was getting impatient. He was circling the same topics, hinting about taking care of business and getting things finalized. He wanted access to something he couldn't reach, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he tried again. And when he did, I would be ready. All I had to do was wait for Brad to make one final mistake. It happened one Sunday afternoon during lunch. The kind of quiet day that feels too ordinary to hold anything significant until it does. I'd invited Maggie and Brad over again, pretending it was just another family meal. I'd made roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and an apple pie, Brad's favorite. Everything about the scene was familiar, safe, domestic. But I knew before the first bite that this would be the day everything changed. Brad was in a talkative mood, filling the room with his usual stories about work, his coworkers, his successes. I'd heard it all before, embellishments stacked on top of exaggerations, until even Maggie had stopped listening. She stared at her plate, her fork tracing patterns in the potatoes. Something in her had shifted recently. She wasn't as bright-eyed when he spoke. She didn't laugh at his jokes. Maybe she was finally starting to see. I waited until after dessert to start my part of the performance. I set down my fork, smiled warmly, and said, Brad, you've been such a help to me lately. I really do appreciate it. He leaned back in his chair, smug. Well, I try my best. Someone's got to make sure you're taken care of. Maggie glanced at him, frowning slightly, but he didn't notice. I continued. I was thinking, maybe it's time to get everything in order. You know, my accounts, my will, all of it. I don't want any confusion later. His entire posture shifted, alert, eager. That's a great idea, he said quickly. We can take care of that this week. I'll set up a meeting with your bank. Oh, I already took care of that, I said lightly, slicing myself another piece of pie. But I'd like to go over it together. Just to make sure you understand what's in it. Brad looked slightly thrown off. You already took care of it? Yes, I said, taking a small bite, as calm as ever. In fact, why don't we call my lawyer right now? He can explain the details. The room went very still. Maggie's eyes darted between us. Brad's jaw tightened, his confident mask flickering for the briefest moment. Then he laughed. Oh, that's not necessary. I trust you. I insist, I said, already dialing Mr. Fuller's number and putting the phone on speaker. Mr. Fuller answered on the third ring, his voice warm as always. Good afternoon, Mrs. Walker. How are you? Just fine, thank you, I said sweetly. I was sitting here with Maggie and Brad, and we were talking about my will. I wanted you to confirm the current arrangement for us. There was a pause, a deliberate one. Then Mr. Fuller spoke clearly, his tone professional and firm. Of course. As of your last update, your estate is divided between your daughter, Maggie Walker, and the Children's Hope Foundation. There are no other beneficiaries. Brad's fork clattered against his plate. Maggie blinked, confused. Wait, she said slowly. What about, Mr. Fuller continued, as if reading from a script. Additionally, Mrs. Walker's will specifies that Maggie's inheritance is conditional upon her being unmarried to Mr. Bradley Carter at the time of distribution. Brad's face turned red. The polite smirk he always wore twisted into something darker. "What?" he snapped. Mr. Fuller's voice didn't waver. "Would you like me to read the clause aloud, Mr. Carter?" Brad stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped the floor. "No," he barked. "That won't be necessary." Maggie looked from him to me, stunned. "Mom, why would you do that?" I kept my voice even. "Because I wanted to make sure everything was taken care of properly. I've had concerns." Brad's eyes narrowed. "Concerns? About what? You think I'm trying to take your money?" I held his gaze. "I don't think, Brad." "I know." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through the air. Maggie's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Brad laughed a harsh, nervous sound. "You've lost it," he said. "You're paranoid, Corinne. You need help." "Maybe," I said calmly. "But I'm not as forgetful as you'd like people to believe." He took a step toward me, his voice lowering. "You've been listening to people. You're letting others poison you against your own family." "Family doesn't forge signatures," I said quietly. "Family doesn't drain bank accounts behind someone's back." Maggie's head snapped toward him. "What is she talking about?" she demanded. Brad froze, his mouth opening and closing like he was searching for the right lie. I didn't give him time to find it. I opened my purse, pulled out the folder I'd been carrying for weeks, and dropped it on the table. Inside were printed copies of the forged transfer request, the altered checks, and photos of the documents he'd handled. Maggie reached for them with trembling hands. "Brad," she whispered. "Please tell me this isn't true." He stammered something about misunderstandings, clerical errors, and my supposed confusion, but the color had drained from his face. He knew it was over. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of years of silence lift off my shoulders. "You called me weak," I said. "You laughed at me. But you forgot something weak. People don't survive everything I've been through." For a moment, no one spoke. The ticking clock in the corner was the only sound in the room. Then Maggie pushed her chair back, tears filling her eyes. She stood, walked past him, and went straight to the front door. "I need air," she whispered. Brad looked like he wanted to follow her, but instead he turned to me with a glare so venomous it could have burned holes through wood. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "Maybe," I said, my voice steady. "But not as much as you will." He stormed out after her, slamming the door so hard the picture frames rattled on the wall. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty chairs, the half-eaten food, and the cooling pie. My hands trembled not from fear this time, but from release. That phone call ended Brad's charade but began the unraveling of my family. The next day, Maggie came to my house in tears. I'd barely slept the night before, my mind replaying every moment of that confrontation. Brad's face twisting from arrogance to panic. The look in Maggie's eyes when she realized something wasn't right. I'd expected anger from her. What I didn't expect was heartbreak. She knocked softly, like a child who wasn't sure if she'd be welcomed. When I opened the door, her mascara was streaked down her cheeks, her hair messy, her hands trembling. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Can I come in?" I didn't say anything. I just stepped aside and let her pass. She walked straight to the living room and sat on the couch, clutching a tissue like it was the only thing holding her together. For a moment, the silence between us was unbearable. "Finally," she said, "he told me you're lying." Her eyes lifted to mine, searching for something: hope, truth, anything that would make this easier to believe. "He said you've been confused for months, that you've been making things up." I sat down beside her, calm and steady. "Do you believe that?" I asked quietly. Her lips quivered. "I don't know what to believe." Without another word, I stood and walked to the safe. I pulled out the folder I'd kept hidden, the one with every document, every photo, every piece of proof. When I placed it on the coffee table in front of her, she looked at it like it was a snake ready to strike. "Go ahead," I said. "See for yourself." She hesitated before opening it. Her fingers shook as she turned each page, the forged checks, the bank records, the audio transcripts Detective Hawthorne had transcribed from my recordings. With every page, her breath hitched a little more. When she reached the photo of the transfer request, the one with my falsified signature, she covered her mouth and gasped. He really did this? She whispered. I nodded slowly. He did. Her tears fell harder then. Silent at first, then uncontrollable. She pressed her palms against her face, her shoulders shaking. I didn't want to believe it, she sobbed. He told me you were getting forgetful. He said you'd been signing things without realizing it. I felt my throat tighten. But I held her close. I know, sweetheart. He's good at twisting things. That's how people like him survive. They make others doubt what's real. She leaned against me like she used to when she was little, when nightmares woke her up in the middle of the night. Only this nightmare was real, and there was no waking up from it. After a while, she lifted her head, her face red and swollen. I don't understand how I didn't see it, she said, her voice cracking. He controlled everything, our money, my schedule, even who I spent time with, and I thought he was just being protective. Love can make you blind, I said softly. Especially when someone's clever enough to use that love against you. She sniffled, nodding slowly. What happens now? I've already spoken with the detective, I said. He's been collecting evidence. There's enough to press charges if you want to cooperate. She looked at me sharply. If I want to? You're his wife, Maggie. The law might see that differently. But I won't force you. You need to decide what's right for you. She fell silent for a long moment, staring down at her hands. Then she whispered, He's leaving tonight. He packed his bags after I confronted him this morning. I told him not to come back. I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Good, I said. That's the first step. Her eyes filled again, but this time there was something else behind them, determination. I want to help the police, she said. I don't care what it costs me. He deserves to pay for what he's done to you, to me, to everyone he's lied to. I nodded, proud and pained all at once. Then we'll do it together. We spent the rest of the afternoon going through the documents one by one. I explained everything: the forged will, the missing checks, the transfer he tried to make. Each revelation made her sit a little straighter, as if reclaiming parts of herself she hadn't realized she'd lost. As the sun set, the light through the curtains turned golden, softening the room in a way that almost felt merciful. Maggie stood by the window, looking out at the garden her father had planted years ago. You always told me strength didn't have to be loud, she said quietly. That it could be steady, quiet, and patient. I never understood what you meant until now. I walked over and put my arm around her. Strength doesn't mean never breaking, I said. It means putting yourself back together afterward. She nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner, Mom. There's nothing to be sorry for, I whispered. You see it now, and that's what matters. We stood there for a long while, the house quiet except for the distant hum of the refrigerator. For the first time in years, I felt the distance between us melt away. Later that night, after she'd gone home, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the empty chair where Brad had once sat so confidently. His voice still echoed faintly in my memory, the arrogance, the cruelty, the entitlement. But it no longer scared me. It only reminded me of how far I'd come. But even after Brad was gone, the damage he left behind wasn't done with us. Life after Brad felt both peaceful and painfully empty. The house no longer buzzed with tension or the sound of his voice lingering over every conversation, but silence had its own weight. For weeks, Maggie and I moved through our lives like survivors walking through the wreckage after a storm, relieved to still be standing, yet haunted by what had been destroyed. Maggie moved back in with me temporarily. She brought only 2 suitcases, one filled with clothes and the other with guilt. The first few nights were the hardest. I'd hear her crying softly in the guest room, thinking I couldn't hear. I didn't go in right away. I wanted her to have her space, to let her heart break fully before trying to mend it. Grief for love, even poisonous love, is still grief. Eventually, she started coming into the kitchen in the mornings while I made coffee. Her eyes would be red, but she'd smile a little when I handed her a cup. Small rituals like that helped us both breathe again. Detective Hawthorne kept me updated. Brad's financial activities had been traced to several accounts he'd opened in his own name. The evidence was strong, but investigations move slowly. "You don't need to worry," he told me. "We'll take care of it." For the first time in months, I actually believed him. I spent my days tidying the house, taking long walks, and rediscovering the simple things I'd neglected when my life revolved around guarding secrets. I baked again, filled the rooms with the scent of cinnamon and vanilla. I planted new roses in the garden, bright red ones, as if to remind myself that beauty could still grow from pain. Maggie started joining me on those walks. Sometimes we'd talk about her childhood, how her father used to take her to the lake on Sundays, how he'd sneak her candy when I said no. Other times, we'd just walk in silence, both of us knowing that words couldn't fix everything. Healing isn't always loud or visible. Sometimes it's just the act of keeping pace beside someone who once felt lost. About a month after Brad left, I received a call from Detective Hawthorne. "We've wrapped up the investigation," he said. "The case is ready to move forward. We'll be charging him soon." I thanked him quietly, my hands trembling as I hung up. It was relief, but it was also sorrow. Relief that justice was coming, but sorrow for what it cost us to reach it. That evening, Maggie and I sat in the living room with 2 cups of tea. "They're pressing charges," I told her. She nodded slowly, staring at the steam curling above her cup. "He texted me yesterday," she said. "He said he made a mistake, that he just wanted to fix things." I sighed. "He'll keep saying that, honey. Not because he means it, but because control is all he knows." She looked up at me, her eyes tired but clearer than they'd been in months. "I'm done letting him control me," she said quietly. And I believed her. A few days later, she enrolled in a local business course. She said she wanted to understand finances better, to take back the independence she'd lost. Watching her study at the kitchen table each night filled me with a strange kind of pride. It was like seeing a flower that had been trampled start to stand upright again. I also found myself drawn to something new. One morning, while reading the paper, I saw an article about a local women's shelter looking for volunteers to teach basic budgeting and financial safety. Without overthinking it, I called them. They welcomed me with open arms. The first time I stood in front of those women, some young, some older, all of them carrying invisible bruises of manipulation, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. I told them parts of my story. Not names, not details. Just lessons. "Kindness is not weakness," I said. "But trust should always be earned, not assumed." Their eyes met mine. Some filled with tears, some with recognition. It was healing not just for them, but for me. At home, Maggie began cooking again. The kitchen was alive with laughter and the clatter of pans, the kind of sound I thought I'd never hear again. Slowly, the house that once felt like a cage began to feel like home. One night, we sat outside under the stars, sharing a bottle of wine. Maggie looked at me with a soft smile. "Do you ever miss him?" she asked. I thought about it. "No," I said after a pause. "But I do miss the person I thought he was." She nodded, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. "Me too." For a moment we just sat there, letting the night wrap around us. I realized then that peace isn't the absence of pain, it's learning to live with it without letting it define you. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. The return address made my heart sink. Brad Carter. I turned it over in my hands, debating whether to open it. Curiosity won. The handwriting was his, neat and deliberate. Inside was a single page, no greeting, no apology, just words dripping with self-pity. He wrote that I'd ruined his life, that Maggie would regret choosing my side, that someday we'd both realize how weak and ungrateful we were. I read it once, then tore it in half. The fear his words once held over me was gone. They were just ink on paper now. I threw the pieces into the fireplace and watched them curl into ash. But then, out of nowhere, a letter from Brad arrived at my doorstep. The letter began with, "I'm sorry," but the tone was anything but remorseful. There was no warmth in those words, only manipulation dressed in apology. I had torn open the envelope out of curiosity, a part of me still hoping foolishly that he might have found the decency to own up to what he'd done. But as I read, I realized the only thing Brad regretted was losing control. He wrote about how I'd misunderstood his intentions, how everything he did was for Maggie's security. Then came the familiar barbs, hidden beneath flowery language accusations that I'd turned Maggie against him, that I'd stolen his family. Each line was another attempt to claw back power, to remind me that even from a distance, he wanted me to feel small. And then, near the end, he wrote, "You'll regret cutting me out of your life. People like you don't last long without help." I sat there for a long moment, staring at that final line, feeling the chill of recognition. He hadn't changed, he never would. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it into a plastic sleeve, and placed it in the folder I'd kept for evidence. I wasn't saving it, and out of sentiment I was saving it for the detective. That evening, I called Detective Hawthorne and read him the message. He sighed on the other end of the line. "He's grasping at straws," he said. "Don't respond to him. Forward the letter to me. We'll add it to the record." When I hung up, I looked at the fireplace where his last letter had turned to ash. I almost fed this one to the flames too, but no, this one had a purpose. This was proof that his manipulation didn't stop, even when his power was gone. Later that night, Maggie came home from her evening class. She noticed the open envelope on the counter and frowned. "Another letter?" "Yes," I said softly. "He's not done trying." She took it, read a few lines, and her expression shifted from sadness to anger. "He's still blaming you?" she said incredulously. "After everything he did?" "That's what people like him do," I said. "They rewrite the story until they believe it themselves." Maggie sat down beside me, her hands shaking slightly. "He texted me this morning too. He said he's going to contest the will in court." I laughed quietly, though there was no humor in it. "Let him try. Everything's airtight. He'll only humiliate himself." Still, I could see the worry in her eyes. "Mom, what if he shows up again?" I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Then we'll deal with it together. He can't hurt us anymore, Maggie, not where it matters." The next morning, I met with Mr. Fuller to discuss the letter. He read it silently, then looked up with a sigh. "He's desperate," he said. "But don't worry, he has no legal standing. The evidence you've gathered protects you completely." "Still," I said quietly, "it's unsettling. He's not used to losing." "No, Mr. Fuller agreed. "But now he's losing on every front. That kind of man doesn't just vanish quietly. Stay vigilant." I promised I would. Weeks passed, and the season began to change. Autumn leaves carpeted the streets, and the air grew crisp. Life started to feel normal again, though sometimes I'd still catch myself glancing at the mailbox with a flicker of unease. Maggie was healing, her laughter was returning, tentative at first, then stronger. She even joked once about how she couldn't believe she'd ever tolerated Brad's smugness. It was a small victory, but I cherished it. Then one afternoon she came home with a thick envelope in her hand, her expression a mix of dread and relief. "It's from the courthouse," she said. "The divorce papers are finalized." For a moment, neither of us spoke. She looked down at the document, tracing the embossed seal with her thumb. "It's strange," she said softly. "I thought I'd feel free. But I just feel empty." "That's normal," I said, wrapping my arm around her shoulders. "You're mourning a version of love that never really existed." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "You saved me, Mom," she whispered. "If you hadn't stood up to him..." "I didn't save you, sweetheart. You saved yourself. I just made sure you saw what I already knew." That night, we sat together on the couch, the divorce papers lying between us like a silent symbol of closure. The weight of the past year felt heavy, but for once, it wasn't suffocating. It was the weight of endurance, the kind you earn when you refuse to break. The next morning, I mailed the original letter to Detective Hawthorne, just as I'd promised. I sealed the envelope, pressing down on the flap with a sense of finality. I thought that would be the end of it, the last piece of Brad's poison leaving my life for good. But a week later, I got a call from the detective. His tone was sharper this time. "Mrs. Walker," he said. "Brad's been contacting a few of your acquaintances asking about your health, your mental state. It looks like he's preparing to claim you're unfit to manage your finances." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "He's trying to paint me as unstable," I said flatly. "Yes," Hawthorne replied. "But don't worry, we've already documented enough to counter anything he tries. Just be careful. Men like him don't handle defeat well." I thanked him and hung up, my hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from fury. Even now, even after being exposed, he couldn't let go of control. He still wanted to make me look small. That night, as I sat in my armchair by the fire, I stared into the flames, watching them dance and curl. Maggie came into the room, her hair pulled back, her eyes steadier than they'd been in months. "Detective Hawthorne called me too," she said. "He told me everything. Don't worry, Mom. He doesn't scare me anymore." I looked up at her, and for the first time since this began, I saw true strength in her face, not the kind born from defiance, but from understanding. She had finally learned that calm is its own form of power. We spent the rest of the evening quietly, just the two of us, the sound of crackling fire filling the silence. Brad's chapter in our lives was closing, but his greed wasn't finished haunting us yet. 2 months later, Brad appeared at my front gate demanding to talk. I was in the garden pruning my roses when I heard his voice, sharp, insistent, cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Corinne! Open the gate! We need to talk." For a moment, I froze, shears in hand, my pulse quickening. I hadn't seen him in person since the day everything fell apart. His voice was exactly as I remembered, entitled, full of that same false authority he used to command every room. I straightened my back and looked toward the gate. There he was, in a wrinkled jacket and jeans, looking disheveled but still carrying that air of self-importance. His face was thinner, his eyes darker. There was no remorse in them, just anger and desperation. "I told you never to come here again," I said firmly, keeping my distance. He gripped the metal bars of the gate. "You've ruined my life, Corinne. I lost everything, my job, my house, my reputation, all because of your lies." "Your lies did that," I replied, my voice even. "Not mine," he scoffed. "Oh, please, you've always been dramatic. You and Maggie so quick to play the victims. Do you have any idea what people are saying about me?" "I don't particularly care," I said. That made him snap. He slammed his hand against the gate, the sound echoing through the street. "You think this is over? You think you can just erase me?" Neighbors began peeking from their windows. I saw Mrs. Rowe across the street standing on her porch, phone in hand. Brad noticed too, his expression twisting with embarrassment. He lowered his voice but not his venom. "You're making a mistake. I just want what's mine. Nothing here belongs to you," I said quietly. "Not my house, not my money, not even my daughter's love." His jaw tightened. "You're going to regret this, old woman." I took a step closer, meeting his glare without flinching. "I already did once," I said. "Never again." At that moment, Maggie's car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out and froze when she saw him. "Brad?" Her voice wavered between shock and anger. "What are you doing here?" He turned toward her, his expression softening instantly, his favorite act. "Maggie, please. I just wanted to talk, to explain." "Explain what?" she snapped. "How you forged my mother's signature. How you tried to steal from her. You're lucky she didn't have you arrested months ago." He tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "You don't understand, sweetheart. I did it for us, for our future." "For our future?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "You mean your future?" I could see, the neighbors watching, hear the whispers starting. Brad's face turned red again. He took a step back, his composure crumbling. "You both think you've won," he hissed. "But this isn't over." I pulled out my phone. "You need to leave, Brad. Right now. Before I call the police." He stared at me for a moment longer, eyes burning with hatred. Then, with a low growl, he turned and stormed off down the sidewalk. Maggie stood there, shaking, her fists clenched. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders and guided her inside. Once the door was locked, she broke down. "He won't let go," she said, through tears. "He's obsessed, Mom, I can feel it, he's not done with us." I held her close, my voice calm but resolute. That's what desperate men do when they lose control. But this time, he's not holding any of the cards. The next morning, I called Detective Hawthorne. He came by to take my statement, his notebook already open. When I told him what happened, he frowned. "You did the right thing calling me. He's been under investigation for new forgeries. Your case helped open that door." I blinked. "New forgeries?" Hawthorne nodded grimly. "He's been trying to access accounts under false pretenses. Not just yours, others too. Looks like he's running out of options." The anger in me simmered into something sharper. "Then stop him before he hurts someone else." "We will," Hawthorne assured me. "I'll make sure there's a restraining order in place by tomorrow morning." True to his word, the papers arrived the next day. The officer who served them explained that Brad was now legally forbidden from coming near me or contacting Maggie. For the first time in months, I felt like the law was finally catching up to the truth. That night, Maggie and I sat together in the living room. She looked exhausted but calmer. "I can't believe he showed up like that," she said. "I can," I replied. "It's his last attempt to stay relevant, to remind us he still exists." She sighed. "Do you think he'll stop now?" I looked into the fire, watching the flames crackle softly. "No," I said honestly. "But he's running out of moves." And I was right. A few days later, Detective Hawthorne called again. His tone was different this time, grim but satisfied. "Brad tried to access another client's account," he said. "We caught him. He's being brought in for questioning tomorrow." I felt a slow exhale leave my lungs, one I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "It's finally happening," I whispered. "Yes," Hawthorne said. "And this time, he won't be walking away." That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped out into the cool evening air. The world felt quiet, finally at peace. The roses in the garden swayed gently in the breeze, and I thought of my husband, how he would have smiled at how far I'd come. I wasn't the fragile widow Brad had tried to control. I was the woman who'd outlasted him, outsmarted him, and rebuilt her life from the ashes of his deceit. And when justice finally arrived, it came louder than I ever imagined. Brad was arrested 6 weeks later for financial fraud and identity theft. I'll never forget the call from Detective Hawthorne that morning. His voice carried the weight of satisfaction, the kind that comes only after months of pursuit finally reach their end. "We've got him, Mrs. Walker," he said. "He's in custody. The evidence you provided played a major part in this." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I just stood there in my kitchen, holding the phone in one hand, staring out the window at the rose bushes I'd tended through every storm of the past year. My knees felt weak, but not from fear this time. Relief flooded through me like sunlight breaking after a long night. When I hung up, I called Maggie. She answered on the first ring, her voice breathless. "Mom? They've arrested him," I said simply. There was a pause, then a sob, sharp and unrestrained. "Finally," she whispered. "Finally. It's over." But it wasn't quite over. A few weeks later, we found ourselves sitting in a courtroom, side by side, ready to face him one last time. The courtroom was small and cold, the kind of place where justice doesn't shout, it speaks quietly, firmly, in the measured rhythm of gavel strikes and legal terms. Brad was escorted in wearing a gray suit that didn't fit as well as it used to. His hair was unkempt, his eyes dull, but he still tried to wear that same smug expression. Only this time, it looked hollow, desperate. He glanced at me once. It wasn't the confident stare of a man who thought he held power, it was the glare of someone cornered. I met his eyes without flinching. For the first time, he looked away first. The prosecutor began outlining the charges. Multiple counts of forgery, attempted fraud, and financial exploitation. They presented evidence from the bank, from other victims, and from my own meticulous documentation, the recordings, the bank transfers, the forged signatures. Every piece of paper, every photograph, every word from that little notebook I'd filled became a brick in the wall closing in on him. Then came the audio recordings. The courtroom was silent as Brad's own voice filled the room, dripping with arrogance. "Don't worry, Mom," the recording played. "I'll handle it for you. You're too forgetful these days." And then later, his sneering whisper, "You don't have much time to think, old woman." I watched his face as the words echoed off the courtroom walls. He flinched, his jaw tightening. Maggie's hand found mine under the table, gripping tightly. I could feel her trembling, but not from fear, from strength. She was no longer the woman he'd controlled. When it was her turn to testify, she stood and walked to the witness stand with a grace I hadn't seen in years. Her voice quivered at first, but as she spoke, it grew steadier. "I loved him," she said. "I believed him. But he lied to me, to my mother, and to everyone he ever met. He made me doubt myself, doubt the woman who raised me. And now, I see what he really was, a man who thought kindness was weakness." Even the judge seemed moved. When my turn came, I took a deep breath and walked to the stand. I could feel every eye on me, but I didn't tremble. I spoke about the betrayal. About the fear of being called crazy. About pretending to be weak just to expose the truth. "He underestimated me," I said, my voice calm. "He thought I was too old, too fragile, too soft to see through him. But strength isn't about how loud you can shout or how hard you can fight. Sometimes, it's about patience. About waiting until your enemy thinks you've surrendered, then standing back up." The courtroom was silent when I stepped down. Even Brad wouldn't look at me. After closing arguments, the judge leaned forward, reading through the final report before delivering the verdict. "Bradley Carter," he said, his tone heavy with authority. "This court finds you guilty on all counts." Brad's shoulders slumped. The gavel struck once, echoing through the room. Maggie covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. I felt mine too, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were release. The judge ordered restitution to my estate and to the other victims Brad had defrauded. But the money didn't matter. What mattered was that the truth had finally been spoken out loud, in front of witnesses, in front of the law. As they led him away in handcuffs, Brad looked over his shoulder and muttered, "You'll regret this." I met his glare with a small, calm smile. "No, Brad," I said quietly. "Regret is what brought you here." He didn't answer. The guards pulled him through the door, and the heavy wooden panel shut behind him with a dull thud. Just like that, the chapter closed. Maggie threw her arms around me, sobbing into my shoulder. "You saved me, Mom," she whispered. "No," I murmured. "We saved each other." Outside the courthouse, the sky was bright and clear, as if the world itself had exhaled with us. The crowd slowly dispersed, and I stood there for a while, looking up at the sunlight breaking through the clouds. For the first time in a long time, I felt weightless. Justice had been served not just by the court, but by the quiet strength that Brad had mocked all along. I had survived his manipulation, his lies, his cruelty, and I had done it without lowering myself to his level. Sometimes, justice doesn't roar. It whispers through the calm of a woman who refused to be broken. But even as justice was done, I knew this story wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming power. A year later, I stood in my garden, feeling the breeze on my face. The same roses that once wilted under neglect now bloomed brighter than ever, deep crimson, full and alive. It had been 12 long months since Brad was sentenced, 12 months since that final gavel fell and his shadow stopped darkening my door. Life had moved on, but not without leaving its marks. Some scars don't fade, they just stop hurting. Maggie had changed too. She wasn't the timid, apologetic woman she once was. She'd found herself again, piece by piece, rebuilding from the ruins of deceit. She'd started her own small business financial consulting for women who had suffered manipulation or financial abuse. Helping them see what I didn't, she told me one night over dinner. Her smile was soft but steady, the kind that comes from surviving something that should have broken you. I couldn't have been prouder. As for me, I'd learned that peace doesn't arrive all at once. It comes quietly, like morning light creeping into a dark room. Some days, I still caught myself, flinching at unexpected noises, or double-checking that the front door was locked. But most days, the fear was gone. In its place was something stronger: stillness. I spent my mornings volunteering at the women's shelter. I'd sit with women of all ages and tell them stories not about revenge, but about endurance. I told them that kindness was never the same as weakness, and that protecting yourself doesn't make you cruel. I spoke of the strength it takes to let go of someone you once loved, even when that love turned poisonous. Some of them cried. Some just nodded quietly. But every time, I saw a flicker of recognition in their eyes. At night, when the world was quiet, I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea and watch the stars. Sometimes I'd think about my husband, how he'd loved this garden, how he'd always said that roses were stubborn just like me. "They'll grow through anything," he used to say. He was right. Maggie often came by on weekends. She'd bring pastries from her favorite bakery, and we'd sit outside under the shade of the old oak tree. One afternoon, as we sipped coffee and watched the sunlight filter through the leaves, she said softly, "I used to think you were fragile, Mom." I smiled. "I used to let people think that too." She shook her head. "No, I thought your kindness was a weakness. But now I know it's your greatest strength. You never stopped believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it." I reached over and took her hand. "That's what mothers do. We hold on, even when it hurts." She looked down, tears gathering in her eyes. "I wasted so many years letting someone else tell me who I was." I squeezed her hand. "You didn't waste them, sweetheart. You survived them. There's a difference." For a long moment, we just sat there in the quiet hum of the garden, the scent of roses drifting around us. It was a peace we'd both earned the hard way. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Maggie went home, and I stayed outside alone. The golden light turned everything warm, and the shadows stretched long across the grass. I looked around my home, the house that had once felt like a battlefield, now felt sacred again. Every room told a story, not of pain, but of perseverance. I walked into the study where my husband's photograph still sat on the desk. The same picture from years ago, the two of us smiling, young and fearless. I traced the edge of the frame with my fingers and whispered, "You were right, love. Strength doesn't shout, it endures." The next morning, I received a letter from Detective Hawthorne. It wasn't official, just a short note. "Bradley Carter has been transferred to a state facility. Parole denied. Case closed." Simple words, but they carried the weight of finality. For the first time since it all began, I felt something close to freedom. That evening, I lit a candle for my husband, not out of grief, but gratitude. Gratitude that he'd left me with enough courage to fight when I needed to. Gratitude that the man who once called me too weak had been wrong in every possible way. Sometimes I still hear Brad's voice in my memory, taunting, dismissive, dripping with arrogance, but it no longer fills me with anger. It almost makes me smile. Because without realizing it, his cruelty had been the catalyst that awakened the strength I didn't know I still had. I used to think power meant control, that strength meant standing tall and unbending. Now I know the truth. Strength is gentler. It's the ability to bend without breaking, to face betrayal without becoming bitter, to forgive yourself for trusting the wrong people. One evening, Maggie stopped by after work, and we took a walk through the garden. The air smelled of rain, and the roses glistened under the fading light. She looked at me and said, "You seem happy, peaceful." I smiled. "I am. Do you ever think about him anymore?" Paused for a moment, then shook my head. "Not really. Sometimes maybe. But when I do, it's not anger, I feel it's clarity. He showed me what strength isn't. And because of that, I learned what it truly is. She smiled softly, and we continued walking, side by side, the gravel crunching beneath our feet. When she left that night, I stood at the gate for a long while, watching her car disappear down the road. The moon hung low, bathing the garden in silver light. I breathed in the scent of the roses and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I wasn't the woman Brad thought I was. I was older now, yes, but wiser, tougher, calmer. I'd faced deceit, loss, and humiliation, and I'd come out the other side without losing my compassion. That, I realized, was the kind of strength he'd never recognize. The kind he could never destroy. I turned toward the house, the lights glowing softly through the windows. My home, my sanctuary, my proof that I had endured. Because the truth was simple. I wasn't weak, I was just waiting for the right moment to show my strength.